Our immune system is this incredible, complex army of cells and proteins, all designed to protect us. It's truly amazing. But what happens when that army gets its orders wrong? Today, we're diving deep into immune system dysfunctions. Everything from the frustrating sniffles of an allergy to the terrifying silence of a system that's just given up. And that, right there, is the central question we're going to explore. Think of your immune system like a really powerful weapon. When it's aimed correctly, it's our absolute best protector. But if it's miscalibrated, even just a little, that same incredible power can be turned against us, either by failing to defend us or, even worse, by causing a whole lot of friendly fire. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the two basic ways the system can mess up. Then, we'll dive into hypersensitivity. That's when the system does way too much. After that, we'll flip the script and look at immunodeficiency, which is the dangerous silence that happens when the system does far too little. All right, Section 1, when the system goes wrong. And really, every single problem we're about to discuss boils down to one simple idea: imbalance. The immune system is like a finely tuned engine. It has to operate in a very specific sweet spot. Too little response, and we're totally vulnerable. Too much, and the response itself becomes the disease. And here they are, those two extremes laid out side by side. On the one hand, you can have a deficient response, where the system just underperforms. It fails to clear out pathogens or cancer cells. We call this immunodeficiency. But on the other hand, you can have an excessive response. The system completely overreacts to something harmless, like pollen, or even attacks our own self-antigens. And that's the world of hypersensitivity and autoimmunity.
So let's kick things off with that first extreme, hypersensitivity. This is what happens when the immune response isn't just strong, it's totally exaggerated or completely inappropriate for whatever triggered it.
So what is hypersensitivity, technically? Well, it's an immune reaction against an antigen that is so over the top that it actually ends up damaging our own tissues. It's basically the immune system using a sledgehammer to crack a peanut, and in the process, it just destroys everything around it. A total pathological overreaction. Now, to make sense of all this, immunologists have broken these overreactions down into 4 distinct types, and each one is defined by the specific weapon the immune system decides to use. This chart gives us a great overview, and we're going to break down each one, starting with type 1, which is what most of us just call allergies. Type I is that classic immediate allergic reaction. But here's the thing, the first time you're exposed to an allergen, nothing happens. Instead, your body goes through a process called sensitization. An antigen-presenting cell, an APC, shows the allergen to a Th2 cell, which then tells your B cells to start pumping out a special kind of antibody called IgE. This IgE then goes and sticks to receptors on your mast cells, basically priming them like tiny little grenades. It's only on the second exposure that the allergen finds these primed mast cells, cross-links the IgE, and causes them to degranulate, to explode and release a flood of histamine. And that's what causes all those lovely allergy symptoms. So the key player here is that antibody, immunoglobulin E, or IgE. Now what's fascinating is that its original job in our evolution was to fight off big stuff, like parasitic worms. But in our modern, super clean environments, we hardly ever see those parasites anymore. So this powerful IgE system seems to get, well, bored. And it starts misidentifying totally harmless things like pollen or peanuts as major threats and launches that same massive attack for no good reason. And the consequences of this misdirection? Well, they're pretty stark. Just look at the data. Rates of eczema, asthma, and allergic rhinitis have just exploded since the 1970s, particularly in the Western world. This is the foundation for the famous hygiene hypothesis, the idea that because we're so clean, with fewer childhood infections and parasites, our immune systems are just not properly trained. They're prone to overreacting. Okay, moving on to types 2 and 3. Now these both involve the same kind of antibodies, IgG and IgM, but the key difference is all about location. In type 2, the antibodies bind directly to antigens on the surface of our own cells, essentially tagging them for destruction. But in type 3, the antibodies grab onto floating antigens in our circulation, forming these sticky clumps called immune complexes. These clumps drift around and get stuck in small blood vessels, causing inflammation wherever they happen to land. And finally, we have type 4, which is kind of the oddball of the group. It's not mediated by antibodies at all. Instead, it's driven entirely by T cells. That's why we call it delayed type hypersensitivity.
A rash from poison ivy, for example, takes 24 to 72 hours to show up. That's how long it takes for the sensitized Th1 cells to arrive, recognize the antigen, and release cytokines to call in an army of macrophages, which then cause all that inflammation and tissue damage.
Okay, so that's the story of an immune system doing way too much. Now let's flip the script completely and move to the other side of the coin, immunodeficiency. This is what happens when the system does too little, leaving our bodies dangerously exposed.
And when we talk about immunodeficiencies, we split them into two main buckets based on where they come from. You have primary immunodeficiencies, which are inherited. They're caused by genetic mutations, so you're born with a defect. Then you have secondary immunodeficiencies, which are acquired. This means something from the outside world has damaged a perfectly good immune system.
All right, let's tackle the primary ones first. You can think of these as faults in the genetic blueprint for building our immune system. There are literally hundreds of these different disorders, and each one affects a very specific piece of the immune machinery.
And this chart gives us a fantastic breakdown of where those genetic faults usually pop up. About half, a full 50% of all primary immunodeficiencies involve a problem with producing antibodies. After that, the most common issues are combined deficiencies that affect both T and B cells, and then defects in phagocytes. Those are the eater cells of the immune system.
So let's put some names to these conditions. In XLA, a single defective gene for a protein called Bruton's tyrosine kinase, or BTK, stops B cells from ever maturing, so no antibodies. In DiGeorge syndrome, the thymus gland, which is like the school for T cells, is poorly developed, so you get no functional T cells. And that brings us to one of the most serious forms of all, SCID.
So, severe combined immunodeficiency, we call it SID, it isn't just one disease. It's a whole group of rare, life-threatening disorders that basically cripple the adaptive immune system. Patients with SID have no functional T cells and often no B cells or NK cells either. These are the famous bubble boy cases where infants have to be kept in a totally sterile environment just to stay alive.
And it is just wild how one tiny genetic typo can cause such a complete system failure. The most common form of SCID is caused by a defect in just one protein, the common gamma chain. Think of this chain as a universal antenna that lots of different immune cells use to receive cytokine signals. Without that shared antenna, essential grow and survive messages from molecules like IL-7 and IL-15 just never get through to the developing T cells and NK cells, and as a result, they simply fail to mature, leaving the patient completely defenseless.
But here's the thing, it's not always about faulty genes from birth. In this last section, we're going to look at how a perfectly healthy immune system can be weakened by outside forces. This is what we call secondary or acquired immunodeficiency.
And you might think of some rare, complex virus, but the number one cause, the single most common cause of immunodeficiency on the entire planet, it's malnutrition, plain and simple. The immune system is like a factory. It needs raw materials, proteins, micronutrients to build its soldiers and its weapons. Without that fuel, production just grinds to a halt.
And beyond not getting enough food, there's a whole list of things that can weaken our defenses. The extremes of age are a big one. Infants have undeveloped systems, and the elderly experience something called inflammaging, which impairs their responses. Then you have immunosuppressive drugs, chronic diseases like diabetes or cancer, major surgery, and of course, infections, most famously viruses like HIV that launch a direct assault on our immune cells.
Okay, so let's pull all of this together. The big takeaway is that immune dysfunction is all about a loss of balance. When you have too much response, you get hypersensitivity, which we break down into 4 types based on the mechanism. When you have too little response, you get immunodeficiency, which can be either inherited, that's primary, or acquired, that's secondary. It all comes down to regulation.
And all of this leaves us with a really big, critical question for the future. As our world keeps changing, as pathogens evolve and our lifestyles shift, maybe our biggest challenge isn't just fighting off invaders anymore. Maybe it's learning how to become masters of immune regulation itself. How are we going to learn to perfectly tune this system, to dial it up when it's too quiet and dial it way down when it's screaming too loud, to find that perfect, healthy balance?